Every night, she lit a candle in the window until someone finally came home. But it wasn't who she expected. The candle flame danced against the window glass like a trapped firefly, casting shadows that moved with the rhythm of hope and sorrow. Sarah Mae pressed her small hands against the cold pane, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the empty road that stretched into the darkness beyond their fence. 347 nights she had lit this candle. 347 times she had waited for the sound of familiar boots on the wooden steps. Her father had been gone for almost a year now. The kitchen behind her held the quiet sounds of her mother's grief. The soft scrape of a wooden spoon against the bottom of a pot, the gentle thud of bread dough being kneaded with hands that shook just a little. Martha Cullen had stopped speaking about her husband returning home sometime after the first winter snow had melted. She had packed away his clothes, sold his horse, and accepted the sympathetic nods from the women at Sunday service who whispered about accepting God's will. But Sarah Mae had never stopped believing. "Come away from that window, child." Her mother's voice carried the weariness of someone who had fought this same battle every evening for months. "Your supper's getting cold, and that candle won't bring him back any faster than prayer did." Sarah Mae turned from the window, but kept her hand pressed against the glass. At 15, she was old enough to understand that most folks thought her foolish, but young enough to believe that love could bend the laws of nature if it burned bright enough. Her father had promised he would come home before her 16th birthday, and Thomas Cullen had never broken a promise to his daughter. "Mama," he said he'd come back. The words came out softer than she intended, like a prayer she was afraid to speak too loud. He said the gold up in Angel Creek would set us up proper, and then he'd never have to leave us again. Martha set down her spoon with a sound that seemed too loud in the small kitchen. She was a woman who had aged 5 years in the past 12 months, her brown hair now streaked with silver that caught the lamplight. Her hands, once soft from a life of relative comfort, now bore the calluses of a woman learning to survive alone. "Your father said a lot of things, Sarah Mae." The words weren't unkind, but they carried the weight of a woman who had learned to temper hope with reality. But wanting something and having it happen are two different creatures entirely. Sarah Mae walked to the kitchen table where her plate sat cooling, beans and cornbread with a thin slice of ham they couldn't really afford. She sat down but didn't pick up her fork. Instead, she watched her mother's face in the amber glow of the oil lamp, seeing there the same stubborn line of jaw that she recognized in her own mirror. "Mrs. Henderson says folks in town think I've gone soft in the head," Sarah Mae said quietly. "She told me at the mercantile that grief can make a person do strange things, but that eventually even the strangest grief has to end." Martha sat down across from her daughter, her own plate untouched. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that love isn't the same thing as grief, and that as long as there's love, there's reason to hope." The silence that followed stretched between them, like the distance between their small farmhouse and the gold fields where Thomas Cullen had disappeared. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window glass and making the candle flame flicker but not die. "He could be hurt somewhere, Mama. He could be lying in some hospital bed in Sacramento, not able to remember his own name, waiting for something familiar to call him home." Sarah Mae's voice grew stronger with each word, as if speaking her hope out loud could make it more real. "Or maybe he struck it rich and he's working his way back to us, buying supplies for the journey home." Martha reached across the table and covered her daughter's hand with her own. Her skin was rough now, marked by the work of keeping their small farm running alone, but her touch was still gentle. "And maybe he's dead, child. Maybe he fell down a mine shaft, or caught the fever, or got himself shot by claim jumpers." The words came out in a rush, as if Martha had been holding them back for months and could no longer contain them. "Maybe that candle of yours is burning for a ghost, and all we're doing is keeping ourselves from learning to live without him." Sarah Mae pulled her hand away, not in anger, but with the careful dignity of someone protecting something precious. "Then I'd rather keep company with a ghost than give up on the man who taught me that love doesn't have limits." She stood up from the table and walked back to the window where the candle continued its faithful vigil. The wax had melted into interesting shapes over the months, creating a small sculpture of hardened hope on the windowsill. She had never let it burn all the way down, always replacing it before the flame could die. "Do you remember what he used to say about that old mare of his?" Sarah Mae asked, her breath fogging the glass again. "How she always knew the way home, even in the dark, even when he couldn't see the path himself." Martha nodded slowly. "He said horses have a different kind of knowing, one that doesn't depend on maps or markers." "Well, maybe love is like that too. Maybe it has its own kind of knowing." Sarah Mae pressed both palms against the window now, as if she could push her love through the glass and send it traveling down that empty road. "Maybe somewhere out there, Papa can feel this light burning, and it's helping him find his way back to us." The two women stood in their separate silences, both looking out at the darkness beyond the fence. The road stretched away into the night like a question that had no answer, disappearing into the hills where the gold seekers had gone to chase their dreams of easy fortune. In the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound carried on the wind like loneliness given voice. Martha shivered and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but Sarah Mae remained still, watching and waiting with the patience of someone who believed that faith could outlast doubt. "I won't stop lighting it, Mama," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not until he comes home, or until I know for certain he never will." Martha closed her eyes and felt the familiar ache in her chest, part love, part fear, part admiration for her daughter's fierce loyalty. She had raised a girl who loved without reservation, who believed without evidence, who hoped without guarantee. In a world that seemed designed to break such hearts, Martha wasn't sure if this was a blessing or a curse. The candle flame continued its dance against the glass, steady and bright, and unaware that somewhere in the darkness beyond the hills, something was already moving toward them. Something that would change everything they thought they knew about love, loss, and the surprising ways that prayers sometimes get answered. The man had been walking for 3 days with nothing but guilt for company and dust for water. His boots, once good leather, now gaped at the seams like mouths crying for mercy. The sun had burned his shoulders through his torn shirt, and his lips were cracked so deep they bled when he tried to speak to his horse, the one animal that had stayed loyal when everything else in his life had turned to ash. He didn't remember the name of the town he was walking toward. All the small settlements looked the same after a while. Wooden buildings bleached gray by the sun, streets that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't, people who looked at strangers with a mixture of hope and suspicion. He only knew that his horse needed water and his soul needed something he couldn't name. The guilt followed him like a shadow that grew longer with each passing mile. It whispered to him in the voice of his older brother, reminding him of promises broken and trust betrayed. It showed him images in the heat shimmer that rose from the road, a cave-in at the mine, the sound of falling rock, the terrible silence that came after the screaming stopped. His name was Daniel Cullen, though he'd been trying to forget it for the better part of a year. As the sun began to set behind the hills, painting the sky the color of old blood, he saw a light in the distance. Not the harsh yellow glow of a saloon or the flickering flame of a street lamp, but something softer, a gentle beacon that seemed to pulse with its own quiet heartbeat. Something about that light made his chest tighten with a feeling he thought he had drunk away months ago. Hope. His horse, a bay mare named Sorrow, a name that had seemed fitting when he'd bought her from a widow in Carson City, lifted her head and nickered softly. Even she seemed drawn to that distant glow, as if it promised the water and rest they both desperately needed. As they drew closer, Daniel could see that the light came from a small farmhouse set back from the road, its windows glowing with the warm yellow of oil lamps and something else, something that made his heart beat faster despite himself. In one window, higher than the others, a single candle burned with steady determination. The sight of it hit him like a physical blow. He remembered another candle in another window in the house where he and Thomas had grown up. Their mother had lit it every night when their father was away driving cattle, believing that love could guide a man home through the darkest wilderness. She had died still lighting that candle, still believing in the power of faithful waiting. Daniel's knees gave out, and he found himself kneeling in the dusty road, his face buried in his hands. Sorrow stood beside him, patient as stone, her reins trailing in the dirt. The weight of what he had done, what he had failed to do, pressed down on him like a mountain of broken rock. He had let his brother die. He had run instead of staying to dig Thomas out of that collapsed mine shaft. He had chosen his own life over the brother who had trusted him, who had followed him to Angel Creek because Daniel had promised they would strike it rich together. The sound of footsteps in dry grass made him look up through his fingers. A girl was walking toward him, moving with the careful grace of someone approaching a wounded animal. She carried a tin cup in her hands, and the moonlight caught in her dark hair like silver threads. "Mister," her voice was soft but not afraid. "You hurt." Daniel tried to speak, but only managed a croak that sounded more animal than human. The girl knelt down beside him and held out the cup. The water inside smelled clean and sweet, like rain on fresh earth. "Go on," she said gently. "You look like you've been walking a long time." He took the cup with shaking hands and drank slowly, letting the water wash away some of the dust and all of the words he couldn't say. When he finally looked up at her face, the cup nearly slipped from his fingers. She had Thomas's eyes, the same deep brown, the same flecks of gold that caught the light, the same expression of quiet kindness that had made his brother the sort of man people trusted without question. But this was impossible. Thomas had never mentioned having a daughter, had never spoken of any family except their parents, who had died years ago. "What's your name, mister?" the girl asked, settling back on her heels like she had all the time in the world to wait for an answer. "Daniel," he managed, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Daniel." "Cullen." The girl's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked like she might cry. Then her face changed, becoming careful and closed, like someone who had learned to protect hope from disappointment. "Cullen," she repeated slowly. That's my name too. Sarah Mae Cullen." Daniel felt the world tilt sideways. He stared at this girl, this young woman, really, and saw not just Thomas's eyes but his brother's stubborn chin, his careful way of thinking before speaking, his habit of tilting his head when he was trying to understand something difficult. "Your father," Daniel whispered. "What's your father's name?" "Thomas," she said, and the word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. "Thomas Cullen. He's been gone almost a year now, working the gold fields up at Angel Creek." Daniel closed his eyes and felt something break open inside his chest. This was Thomas's daughter, the child his brother had talked about constantly during those long nights at the mine. The reason Thomas had been so desperate to strike it rich, the person he had promised to make proud. "I've been lighting a candle for him every night," Sarah Mae continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a secret. "Mama thinks it's foolish, but I believe love can call a person home if you hold on to it hard enough." Daniel opened his eyes and looked up at that window where the candles still burned, steady and bright and full of faith he didn't deserve. This girl had been waiting for her father, the man Daniel had failed to save, the brother whose death he carried like a stone in his chest. "The candle," he said hoarsely. "How long have you been lighting it?" "Every night since he left. 348 times now." She said it like it was a prayer she had memorized, like the number itself had power. Daniel struggled to his feet, his legs shaky as a newborn colt's. Sarah Mae rose with him, still watching his face with those familiar eyes. Behind her, the farmhouse waited in its circle of lamplight, and he could see the shadow of a woman in the doorway, someone who had heard voices and come to see what stranger the night had brought to their door. "Miss," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of everything he couldn't yet confess, "I think there's something I need to tell you about your father." But even as he said it, Daniel wasn't sure he had the courage to break this girl's heart, to extinguish the hope that had kept her lighting candles for a dead man. Looking into her face, seeing Thomas's faith reflected there, he wondered if some truths were too heavy for even the strongest hearts to bear. Martha Cullen stood in her doorway, like a sentinel guarding against hope itself. The lamplight behind her cast her shadow long across the wooden porch, and Daniel could see in the set of her shoulders the same wariness that had kept her family alive through hard seasons. She had heard her daughter talking to a stranger, and now she watched this broken man with the careful eyes of a woman who had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. Sarah Mae, Martha called softly, never taking her gaze off Daniel. Come away from there. But Sarah Mae didn't move. She stood between them like a bridge spanning dark water, her hand still holding the empty tin cup, her face caught between curiosity and something deeper, a recognition that seemed to pull at the edges of memory. Mama, she said, her voice carrying a strange note of wonder, this is Daniel Cullen. He says he has something to tell us about Papa. The name hit Martha like a physical blow. Daniel watched her face change, saw the careful mask slip for just a moment to reveal the raw grief she had been carrying alone. Thomas had spoken of his wife often during those long nights at the mine, how she kept their small farm running with hands that were stronger than they looked, how she never complained about the loneliness, how she had trusted him to come home. Daniel, Martha repeated, and her voice was barely a whisper. Thomas's brother Daniel. He nodded, unable to speak past the weight of shame that sat in his throat like broken glass. Thomas had written letters home, had talked about bringing his younger brother to meet his family once they struck it rich. Daniel was supposed to have been a gift, a surprise, a sign that their fortune had finally turned. Instead, he had become their nightmare. Martha stepped down from the porch, moving with the slow deliberation of someone approaching the edge of a cliff. In the lamplight spilling from the house, Daniel could see that she was younger than he had first thought, maybe 35, with brown hair that caught threads of golden eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom. Where is he? She asked simply. The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Daniel felt the earth tilt beneath his feet, felt the weight of 348 nights of candles pressing down on his shoulders. Behind Sarah Mae, that faithful flame still burned in the window, casting its patient glow across the darkness. Can we go inside? Daniel's voice came out hoarse and broken. Please. This isn't something to say under the stars. Martha studied his face for a long moment, seeing there's something that made her nod once, sharp and decisive. She turned and walked back to the house, her spine straight as a fence post. Sarah Mae followed, still carrying the empty cup like it was something precious. Daniel led Sorrow to the water trough by the barn, his hands shaking as he loosened the mare's girth and pulled off her saddle. The horse drank deeply, and the sound of her satisfaction was the only clean thing in the gathering darkness. When he finally walked to the house, his boots felt like they were made of lead. The kitchen was small and warm, filled with the lingering scent of bread and beans and the quiet comfort of a home where people cared for each other. Martha had set another place at the table, a plate, a fork, a cup filled with water that looked clear as mountain snow. The gesture of hospitality in the face of unknown news made Daniel's chest tighten with something that might have been gratitude. Sarah Mae sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her father's eyes watching his face with an intensity that made him want to look away. Martha remained standing, her back against the kitchen counter, her arms crossed like armor across her chest. Tell us, Martha said simply. Daniel picked up the cup of water and drank slowly, trying to wash away the dust and the fear. When he set it down, his hand was trembling. Thomas and we were working a claim together up at Angel Creek. Been there about 6 months, taking turns going down into the shaft we'd dug. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, like it was coming from very far away. The gold was there, just like we'd hoped. Not enough to make us rich overnight, but enough to give you folks a good life. Sarah Mae leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright with the kind of hope that made Daniel's heart break just a little more. We were supposed to work together, take turns watching each other's backs. That's what you do in the mines. You never let your partner go down alone. Daniel's hands clenched into fists on the table. But I was drinking too much, celebrating too early. And that morning, when Thomas wanted to check a new vein we'd found, the words stuck in his throat like thorns. He looked up at the ceiling, at the walls, anywhere, but at the 2 women who were waiting to learn how their world had ended. I told him I was too sick to work. Told him to go ahead without me, that I'd catch up later. Daniel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But I didn't catch up. I passed out in my bedroll and didn't wake up until I heard the mountain groaning. Martha's face had gone pale as winter sky. Sarah Mae's hands were pressed flat against the table now, her knuckles white with tension. There was a cave-in, Daniel continued, the words falling like stones into still water. Part of the shaft collapsed. By the time I got down there, by the time I started digging, he couldn't finish. The memory of Thomas's voice calling his name, growing weaker with each hour, then finally falling silent, was more than he could bear to speak aloud. "He's dead," Martha said, and it wasn't a question. Daniel nodded, tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed for months finally spilling down his cheeks. I tried to dig him out. Spent 3 days moving rocks with my bare hands until my fingers bled. But I was too late. I was too drunk and too selfish and too late. Sarah Mae made a sound like a wounded animal, a soft cry that seemed to come from someplace deeper than grief. She stood up from the table, so quickly her chair fell backward, and for a moment Daniel thought she might run from the room. Instead, she walked to the window where her candle burned. All this time, she whispered, staring at the flame that had been her nightly prayer. "All these months, I've been lighting this for a ghost." "Sarah Mae," Daniel said desperately, starting to rise from his chair. "No." Her voice was sharp as broken glass. "You don't get to comfort me. You were supposed to watch out for him. You were supposed to be his partner, his brother. And you let him die alone in the dark because you were too drunk to do your job." Each word hit Daniel like a physical blow, but he didn't flinch away from them. He had earned every syllable of her anger, had carried the weight of this moment across hundreds of miles of desert and regret. Martha pushed herself away from the counter and walked to her daughter. She didn't speak, just stood beside Sarah Mae at the window, both of them staring at the candle that had become a monument to hope betrayed. "Why did you come here?" Martha asked finally, her voice empty of everything except exhaustion. "Why bring us this news now, after we've spent all this time waiting?" Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving streaks of dirt and salt across his cheeks. "Because I couldn't run anymore. Because every night for the past year, I've seen that light burning in my dreams, and I knew it was calling me home to face what I'd done." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, heavy with the weight of gold dust and nuggets. "This was Thomas's share of what we found. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd bring it to his family." Martha stared at the pouch like it was a snake coiled to strike. "We don't want your gold." "It's not mine," Daniel said quietly. "It belongs to you and Sarah Mae. Thomas died trying to dig it out for you." Sarah Mae turned away from the window, and Daniel saw that she had been crying silently, her tears catching the lamplight like scattered diamonds. "Do you know what he used to say about you in his letters? He said you were the smart one, the one who always looked out for everybody else. He said when you finally came to visit, we'd be a real family." The words were meant to hurt, and they did their work perfectly. Daniel felt something crumble inside his chest, some last wall he had built to protect himself from the full weight of what he had lost. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and the words felt as inadequate as trying to fill the ocean with a teacup. "I'm so sorry." Martha moved then, walking to the table where the gold pouch sat like an accusation. She picked it up, feeling its weight, then looked at Daniel with eyes that held depths of sorrow he couldn't begin to measure. "Sorry doesn't bring him back," she said simply. "Sorry doesn't give Sarah Mae her father or give me my husband. Sorry is just a word people say when there's nothing left to fix." But even as she spoke, Daniel heard something in her voice that wasn't quite hatred. Something that might have been the beginning of a question, a wondering about what came next when the truth had finally been spoken and the candle had burned down to nothing but memory. Daniel woke before dawn on his third morning at the Cullen farm, his body aching from sleeping in the barn, but his mind clearer than it had been in months. The truth had a way of lifting weight even as it broke hearts, and though Martha and Sarah Mae had barely spoken to him since that night in the kitchen, something had shifted in the silence between them. He had not asked to stay. After his confession, he had simply stood from the table, picked up his hat, and walked toward the door, expecting nothing more than the cold comfort of sleeping under stars with his guilt for company. But Martha had stopped him with a single word. Wait. She had stood there in her kitchen doorway, the lamplight catching in her hair, looking at him with eyes that held depths he couldn't read. The roof on the barn needs fixing before the rains come, she had said quietly. And the fence by the north pasture has 3 posts down. If you're going to carry my husband's death on your shoulders, you might as well make it useful. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even kindness exactly. But it was something more than hatred, and Daniel had taken it like a drowning man takes a rope. Now he stood in the barn doorway, watching the sun paint the eastern sky the color of wild roses, and felt something he had almost forgotten existed. Purpose. The simple, honest weight of work that needed doing and hands able to do it. Sarah Mae appeared at the corner of the house, carrying a bucket toward the well. She moved differently now, without the light, eager step he had noticed that first night. The truth had aged her somehow, taken away some essential brightness that grief alone had not been able to touch. But she was moving forward, and that was something. She saw him watching and stopped, the bucket heavy in her hands. For a moment they looked at each other across the yard, and Daniel saw in her face the same struggle he felt in his own chest, the war between wanting to hate and needing to heal. The chickens need feeding, she said finally, her voice careful and neutral. Mama says to tell you the feed's in the bin by the door. It was the first direct thing she had said to him since learning about her father's death, and Daniel felt it like a small gift he hadn't earned, but would treasure anyway. Thank you, he said simply. Sarah Mae nodded once and continued toward the well. Daniel watched her go, then turned to find the chicken feed, his heart carrying the smallest ember of something that might eventually grow into hope. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Daniel worked from dawn until sunset, his hands learning the particular needs of the Cullen farm. The way the gate to the north pasture hung crooked and needed to be lifted just so, the spot where the barn roof leaked when the wind came from the west, the fence posts that had been weakened by time and weather. He worked mostly in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one that had followed him across the desert. This was the silence of hammers and saws, of honest sweat and useful labor. It filled the empty spaces inside him with something better than guilt, something that felt almost like peace. Martha brought him water at midday and simple meals when the sun grew too hot to work. She never lingered to talk, but she watched him sometimes from the kitchen window, and Daniel could feel the weight of her consideration like a hand on his shoulder. In the evenings, after the chores were done and the animals settled, he would sit on the porch steps and listen to the sounds of the house settling into night. Sometimes he could hear Martha and Sarah Mae talking in low voices, their words too soft to understand, but their tone growing gentler with each passing day. And every night, without fail, Sarah Mae would light her candle in the window. Daniel never asked her about it. He could see the ritual had changed somehow. The movements were more deliberate now, less hopeful and more ceremonial. She lit it as someone might tend a grave, with respect and sorrow, but without the desperate faith that had driven her before. On the 7th morning, Daniel was replacing the broken slats on the front porch when he heard Martha's footsteps behind him. He looked up to find her standing in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool air. "You don't have to keep working without wages," she said, settling down beside him on the top step. "The gold Thomas left, it's enough to pay for help." Daniel set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his shirt. "I'm not working for wages." "Then what are you working for?" He considered the question, watching a hawk circle high above the pasture. "Maybe I'm trying to build something instead of just tearing it down for once." Martha sipped her coffee and studied his face. "You can't bring him back with fence posts and roof repairs." "No," Daniel agreed quietly. "But maybe I can keep his family safe. Maybe I can be the brother he thought I was, even if I can't be it for him anymore." Something in Martha's expression softened then, like ice beginning to thaw at the edges. "Thomas used to talk about you all the time, about how you looked out for him when you were boys, how you taught him to read and helped him with his sums. I failed him when it mattered most." "Yes," Martha said simply. "You did. But people aren't just the worst thing they've ever done, Daniel. They're also all the other things, the good and the bad, and the trying to do better. She stood up and brushed off her skirt, then looked down at him with eyes that held a complicated mixture of grief and something that might have been the beginning of acceptance. Sarah Mae's been asking about you, she said. About what Thomas was like as a boy, about the stories he used to tell. She's curious about her father's brother. That evening, as the sun painted long shadows across the yard, Sarah Mae appeared at Daniel's elbow while he was grooming Sorrow by the barn. She had been quiet all day, more thoughtful than angry, and Daniel had sensed her working up the courage for something. Uncle Daniel? The word came out tentative, like she was trying on a new dress to see if it fit. Daniel's hands stilled on the brush. It was the first time she had called him anything but you or mister, and the simple word hit him like a blessing he hadn't dared hope for. Yes. Mama says Papa used to write songs. Silly songs about the animals and the weather and us. Sarah Mae's voice was soft, almost shy. Do you remember any of them? Daniel set down the brush and looked at this girl who had her father's eyes and her father's way of tilting her head when she was curious about something. I remember one about a stubborn mule named Clara who thought she was smarter than her owner. The smallest smile tugged at the corner of Sarah Mae's mouth. Will you tell it to me sometime? I'd like that, Daniel said, and meant it more than any words he had ever spoken. That night, after supper had been eaten and the dishes washed and put away, Sarah Mae walked to the window where a candle waited. Daniel watched from the kitchen table where he was mending a bridle, expecting to see the familiar ritual of lighting and hoping. Instead, Sarah Mae picked up the candle and held it in her hands, studying the flame as if seeing it for the first time. Then, very deliberately, she blew it out. The sudden darkness in the window felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else. Martha looked up from her sewing, and Daniel saw understanding pass between mother and daughter like a secret shared. I don't need to call him home anymore, Sarah Mae said quietly, setting the extinguished candle on the windowsill. He's not coming. But that doesn't mean the love has nowhere to go. She looked at Daniel then, and in her eyes he saw not the eager hope of a girl waiting for her father, but the steady wisdom of someone who had learned that love could take different shapes, could flow toward unexpected places, could heal wounds it hadn't made. Maybe, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, maybe sometimes the person who comes home is the one who needs saving most. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotions he couldn't name. Outside, the night was darker than it had been in months, but inside the small kitchen, surrounded by the quiet comfort of a family learning to be whole in a different way, he had never seen more clearly. The candle would not burn again, but the light it had represented, the fierce, patient love that refuses to give up on the people it claims. That light had found a new place to live.